My name is Clara Evans. I am 29 years old and I am a paranormal investigator. Since I was a child, I have had an insatiable curiosity for unexplained mysteries, but my goal has always been to separate reality from imagination. My mission has taken me to frightening places, but nothing prepared me for what I found at the Black Hollow Lighthouse on the coast of Maine. I arrived at the fishing village at dusk. A thick fog covered the place, the salty smell of the sea permeating the air. The lighthouse rose in the distance, a dark tower against the red-gray sky, a solitary monument of brick and rust, battered by time and violent waves. Before heading to the lighthouse, I stopped at a small cafe. The eyes of the few customers followed me to the counter. A gray-haired woman with wrinkled hands approached. "You're not from here, are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse and low. "Number, I came to investigate the lighthouse," I replied, trying to sound confident. The silence that followed was almost physical. The lady leaned in, her eyes fixed on mine. "Some secrets are best left buried, young lady. The lighthouse doesn't like visitors." Before I could respond, she walked away. I paid for my coffee and stepped out into the fog. Her words echoed in my mind, but there was no turning back. I had to find out what really happened to Samuel Briggs, the lighthouse keeper who disappeared in 1923. The trail leading to the lighthouse was treacherous. Wet rocks and slippery moss made every step a challenge. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs was deafening. The cold wind bit my face, bringing with it indistinct whispers. When I finally reached the lighthouse, night was already setting in. The structure was larger than I had imagined. Dark bricks covered in mud, broken windows, and a weathered wooden door. Above, the lantern was unlit, but for a moment I swear I saw a dim light flicker. "It must be just a reflex," I muttered, trying to ignore the shivering on the back of my neck. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly like a groan. The interior smelled of salt, mold, and rust. I took the flashlight from my backpack and shone it into the main hall. Damp walls, old furniture covered in dust, and a spiral iron staircase leading to the top. Each step seemed to invite me to climb. I took a deep breath and began the ascent. Each step echoed in the void. The wind whistled through the cracks, creating sounds that sounded like words. When I reached the first landing, I found what was left of the old barracks: a rusty bed, a broken desk, and on top of it a dusty diary. I opened the diary with trembling hands. The handwriting was firm at first, but it got worse with time. Samuel Briggs spoke of endless nights, of voices coming from the sea and shadows dancing among the waves. The lighthouse's light is the only thing that keeps the darkness at bay, but something calls to me. The sea, it calls to me. A shiver ran down my spine. I closed the journal and looked around. A noise behind me made me freeze. It was a soft sound, like wet footsteps on the wooden floor. "Is anyone there?" My voice came out weaker than I wanted. No answer, just the rustling of the wind. I climbed the stairs faster. I needed to get to the lantern room. Maybe there was something there that would explain the reports. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the iron door and stepped inside. The lantern room was small and cold. Broken glass allowed the wind to blow freely. The ancient lens was covered in dust and salt. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. On the floor were wet footprints leading to the edge of the room where the glass was shattered, as if someone had walked there and disappeared. The light from my flashlight failed for a moment. When it came back on, I saw a reflection in the broken glass. A tall, thin figure with soaked clothes and empty eyes. I turned quickly. The room was empty. A whisper filled the air, faint but clear. "Help me." Coldness filled my body. The light from the headlight, which should have been off, shone brightly for a second and then disappeared. I knew something or someone was trapped there. And now it was looking right at me. The whispered "help me" still echoed in my mind. The chill of the lantern room seemed to have seeped into my bones. My heart was pounding and my hands were sweating despite the low temperature. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the lighthouse with all its decay and history was playing tricks on me. but I knew better. The wet footprints were still there, leading to the shattered glass. The light that had shone for a moment and then disappeared was no illusion. Something was trapped here, something that could not rest. Samuel Briggs, or something worse? I took a deep breath and looked out the broken window. The fog was so thick it seemed like a dense white wall. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs echoed like a distant wail. Below, the sharp rocks rose and fell beneath the white foam. "Samuel?" My voice shook. "Are you here?" An oppressive silence answered me. Then a low groan filled the room, like wood creaking under an invisible weight. I turned toward the stairs. The iron door I had left open was now closed. A shiver ran down my spine. I slowly approached the door. I placed my hand on the cold knob and pulled. It didn't budge. It was locked. "No, no, no," I whispered, my voice cracking. I started to knock on the door, but the sound of my fists seemed muffled, as if the room were being swallowed by something invisible. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low, almost a whisper. I turned abruptly. In the middle of the room, where there had been nothing before, stood the figure of a man. His clothes were those of an old lighthouse keeper, soaked and stuck to his thin body. His pale face had empty eyes, and drops of salt water ran down his cheeks, like tears frozen in time. "Samuel Briggs," I whispered. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand me. His cracked lips moved. The light must go on. His voice was hoarse and distant, as if coming from the depths of the sea. "It protects us. If the light goes out, he'll come." "Who?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Before he could answer, a deafening crash shook the tower. The room shook and broken glass tinkled. The air grew even colder. Samuel looked up, his empty eyes widening in terror. "He's here." Suddenly, the fog outside stirred violently. A dark shape, gigantic and shapeless, began to materialize between the cliffs. It was as if the darkness itself was coming to life. The shape stretched out, long, undulating arms emerging from the mist, tentacle-like fingers twisting in the void. A deep roar made the ground vibrate. The air grew heavy, and a sense of utter dread washed over me. Samuel looked at me, his eyes pleading. "Turn on the light." I ran to the flashlight's control panel. The switches were covered in dust and rust. My trembling fingers searched for something that might work. Another crash shook the headlight. One of the dark tentacles reached through the broken window, scraping the floor and leaving a scorch mark. My eyes found a rusty lever. I pulled with all my might. It resisted for a second, then gave way with a groan. The flashlight at the top began to slowly rotate. A beam of bright light cut through the mist, illuminating the darkness like a sword. The shadowy figure outside roared in pain. The tentacles writhed, trying to escape the light. Samuel looked at me one last time. A faint, sad smile played across his lips. "Thank you." His figure began to dissolve, turning into droplets of salt water that evaporated into the cold air. The lighthouse's light shone even brighter. The monstrous shadow shrank, twisting and disappearing into the mist, until all that was left was the sound of the waves and the silence. The iron door creaked open of its own accord. I left the lantern room, my legs shaking. I walked slowly down the stairs, each step echoing in the emptiness. When I reached the lobby, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight had lifted. I opened the lighthouse door and took a deep breath of the salty night air. The sky was clearer now, and the mist was beginning to dissipate. I looked back at the lonely tower. The light continued to spin, strong and steady. Samuel Briggs was free, and the lighthouse, for now, was at peace. My name is Jake Turner. I'm 35 years old, a mystery content producer, and despite the strange places I've visited, I've never encountered anything other than poorly told stories and coincidences. My mission is to expose the truth, separating facts from urban legends. Today, I'm heading to Oregon's Pine Ridge Forest to investigate a story of child disappearances that has been circulating for decades. The trailhead was a narrow opening between twisted trees, almost like a mouth waiting to swallow me. The air was damp and cool, and the late afternoon light filtered through the leaves like golden needles. I turned on my camera and adjusted the microphone. This is Jake Turner, coming from Pine Ridge Forest. I'm about to explore the place where, since the 1950s, several children have disappeared without a trace. Let's see if we can find a logical explanation for this mystery. My voice echoed softly on the trail. I smiled confidently into the camera. It was just another forest, just another story that would lose its power when exposed to the light of reason. I placed the camera on the mount attached to my chest and walked on. The trail was covered in dry leaves and my footsteps made a muffled sound. The silence around me was so dense that it seemed to be watching me. I looked around. Ancient, dark trees surrounded me like motionless sentinels. The forest was so thick that the sky seemed a tangled gray and green. I walked for a few minutes describing the story to the camera. I told them about the children who had disappeared, always between the ages of 5 and 10. Stories spoke of small footprints that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared on the trail, and of children's laughter heard in the darkness. They're just stories, folks. Probably cases of children who got lost, and imagination did the rest. At that moment, my feet stopped by themselves. There was a small footprint on the ground, clearly imprinted in the damp earth. It was fresh, as if someone had passed by there a few minutes ago. A cold draft blew along the trail, and the silence seemed to intensify. The skin on the back of my neck tingled. I took a deep breath, trying to ignore the shiver. Someone must have brought a child for a walk here recently. Nothing major. But something didn't add up. There were no adult footprints around, just that one lone mark. I kept walking, slower now. The daylight was fading and the forest was getting darker. A distant sound caught my attention. I stopped to listen better. It was a child's laughter. The sound came from the right, between the dense trees, a short, light laugh, but full of something wrong. My throat went dry. "Who's there?" I called, my voice small and out of place. No answer. The forest went silent again, but now it was a different silence, filled with expectation. I decided to keep going, convincing myself that the sound was just the wind blowing through the trees. After a few minutes, the trail led me to an old cabin. The wooden walls were rotten and leaning, and the roof was partially collapsed. The door hung on a rusty hinge. Apparently, this is one of the cabins used by lumberjacks in the 1950s. Let's take a look. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly. The interior was covered in dust and dead leaves. Broken toys were scattered across the floor. A headless teddy bear, a rusty spinning top, a chipped building block. Who would leave these here? I bent down to examine the teddy bear. When I touched it, I felt something strange. It was damp and cold, as if someone had just left it there. A laugh sounded right behind me. I spun so fast I almost lost my balance. The door was open. The path outside was plunged into shadow. There was no one there, just still trees and the cold wind. My breathing was ragged. My initial confidence was starting to fade. I got up and left the cabin, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The sky was now almost completely dark. As I turned back to the trail, something made me look down at the ground. More small footprints were there. They went forward, then back, as if someone was following me and stopping each time I stopped. I felt a cold presence behind me. I turned slowly. The trail was empty, but the silence of the forest seemed about to explode into terrible sounds. My breath was short and ragged. The silence of the forest was now a heavy, oppressive blanket. The small footprints on the trail seemed to follow me, moving forward and then back, as if an invisible child were playing with me. The chill of the night began to seep into my bones. "Okay, Jake, breathe. They're just footprints. It could be anything." But my voice was shaking more than I would have liked. What I was saying didn't match what I was feeling. Something was wrong in this forest. I glanced at the camera strapped to my chest and forced a weak smile. "Guys, it looks like we have something interesting here. Fresh footprints, laughter. Let's follow it a little further and see where it takes us." My feet didn't want to move, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, pushed me forward. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, creating long shadows that danced between the trees. Each step made the sound of dry leaves mix with a distant rustling, as if someone were walking with me, always out of sight. The trail seemed to stretch out longer than usual, as if the forest was rearranging itself to keep me inside. The feeling of being watched only grew. I looked back several times, but all I saw were shadows and twisted trees. Suddenly, the rustling stopped. The silence returned, thick and absolute. And then, a voice whispered very close to my ear, "Play with us." I spun so fast that I almost dropped the flashlight. The light danced through the trees, revealing only emptiness. My heart was beating so hard it hurt. A shiver ran down my spine, making every hair on my body stand on end. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound firm. The only answer was a childish laugh that echoed throughout the forest. This time, it wasn't a single laugh. It was several voices coming from all directions, a chorus of invisible children having fun at my expense. I took a step back and felt something move beneath my foot. I looked down. It was an old, dirty, damp teddy bear. It hadn't been there before, the same one I'd seen at the cabin. How had it gotten here? My stomach churned. "I need to get out of here." I turned and began walking quickly down the trail. Each step I took was followed by the sound of smaller footsteps running around me. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't resist. I turned my head quickly. For a split second, I saw a small silhouette among the trees. A child in a white dress, her hair falling over her face. She was still, but her eyes, two dark, empty smudges, were fixed on me. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I blinked, and the figure disappeared. "No, no, no. This isn't real," I whispered desperately. I started running. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. My lungs burned, but fear kept me going. The laughter grew louder, higher pitched, almost hysterical. The trees seemed to close in around me, forming a living prison. My foot tripped over a root and I hit the ground with a thud. The flashlight rolled away, casting light at odd angles. I tried to stand up, but a small cold hand grabbed my wrist. I looked down. A child was crouched beside me. Her skin was too pale, her lips purple. She smiled, but there was no joy on her face, only a desperate emptiness. "You came to play, didn't you?" she whispered. I screamed and yanked my arm free of her icy grip. I grabbed the flashlight and ran without looking back. My feet barely touched the ground. I didn't know if I was going in the right direction. I only knew that I had to get away. Suddenly, I saw a faint light ahead, a familiar glow, the beginning of the trail. I ran toward the exit with all my remaining strength. As I broke through the tree line, I fell to my knees on the cold, damp ground. The silence of the night was now comforting. I was out of the forest. I turned to look at the trail, just darkness. But then I saw a pair of glowing eyes looking at me through the trees, and a soft voice, almost a whisper, reached my ears. "Until next time." The Pine Ridge forest was quiet again, but I knew the echoes of the lost children were still there, waiting for the next visitor. My name is Bill Carson. I'm 45 years old. I've been a truck driver for almost 20 years, and I've seen it all on American roads. Terrible accidents, unexpected storms, creatures crossing the road in the middle of the night, but never anything that couldn't be explained. It was just work. Road, delivery, road again. No ghosts, no mysteries, just miles of asphalt and the roar of the engine. That night I was on the legendary Route 66, cutting through the New Mexico desert. The sky was clear and full of stars, but the road was an endless carpet of black, illuminated only by the headlights of my truck. There were no other vehicles, no houses in sight, just a desolate expanse and the hot wind blowing sand against the bodywork. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 12:37 a.m. I was late for my delivery in Flagstaff, but that was okay. I'd driven this stretch many times before. I turned on the radio to chase away the oppressive silence. Country music played softly, accompanying the steady roar of the engine. Everything was normal. Then, out of nowhere, The music was cut off by a staticky sound. I frowned and turned the dial to adjust the frequency. The static grew louder until a soft voice emerged from the hiss. "Please, help me." The voice was female, weak and desperate. My stomach turned and a chill ran down my spine. I fumbled with the dial again, trying to tune to another station. "I'm stuck. Please help me." The voice came back clearer this time. I glanced at the radio, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. There was no radio signal on this part of Route 66. It was too deserted, far from any station. "It must be some interference," I muttered, trying to stay calm. "Maybe a pirate radio or a lost broadcast." But the voice continued. "Can you hear me? Please. I'm at the house with the rusty sign. He's coming." A picture formed in my mind. An old, abandoned house with a fallen, rusty sign. It was almost a cliché, but it made my skin crawl nonetheless. The road ahead of me seemed endless. The desert stretched out on both sides, empty and indifferent. Suddenly, something appeared at the side of the road. An old, dark structure, barely lit by my headlights. An abandoned house. I slowed down, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The voice's description was accurate. Broken windows, a roof caving in, a rusty sign lying on the ground. It can't be. My voice sounded hoarse. I had two options: keep going and forget about it, or stop and investigate. My logic screamed at me to keep going, but something in the voice, the urgency of it, made me slow down until the truck came to a complete stop. I turned off the engine. The silence was immediate and absolute, broken only by the wind whistling across the desert. I climbed out of the truck, the sand crunching beneath my boots. The house looked even more ominous up close. The front door was ajar, swinging gently on its rusty hinges. The smell of rotting wood and rust permeated the air. I glanced back at my truck. The lights were still on, a small anchor of normalcy in this sea of darkness. "It's just an old house, Bill. Nothing special." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It swung open with a long, ominous creak. The darkness inside was thick, almost solid. I turned on my flashlight and shone it inside. Furniture was covered in dust. Pieces of wallpaper were peeling, and cobwebs hung like curtains. In the center of the room, on a rotting wooden table, sat an old radio. One of those 1950s models with big knobs and a lighted dial. It was on, emitting a soft static. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The static changed, and the soft voice whispered again, "Please, he's coming." A biting cold filled the room. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. I felt a presence behind me, as if something was watching me from the shadows. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, only darkness and the sound of the wind outside. I looked back at the radio. The light on the display blinked. The voice was now closer, almost at my ear. "Run!" Before I could react, a loud crash echoed through the house. The door slammed shut, and the radio emitted a deafening hiss. I was no longer alone. The door slammed shut so hard that the sound reverberated through my chest like a gunshot. My heart raced, and the cold in the room intensified until it felt like bone-piercing ice. The radio continued to hiss, the dim light on the dial blinking like a warning signal. "Run!" the voice whispered again, this time clearer, closer, as if the person were right next to me. My breath caught in my throat. I turned quickly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing but the twisted shadows of the walls and rotting furniture. "This is a hallucination, Bill. It has to be," I said to myself, trying to control my rising fear. But it wasn't a hallucination. The smell of rust, the intense cold, the heaviness of the atmosphere. It was all too real. I took a step back, the wood of the floor creaking under my weight. Then I heard another sound. Slow, shuffling footsteps in the dark hallway to my right. Every fiber of my body screamed to get out of there, but my legs were pinned in terror. The radio screeched louder, the desperate voice shouting, "He's here, get away!" A crash echoed through the hallway. Something heavy fell to the floor, followed by a deep, hoarse breath. I felt a shadowy presence approaching, each step making the floor vibrate slightly. A shadow began to form at the entrance to the hallway, tall and shapeless, with indistinct edges that seemed to blend into the darkness. Finally, my body reacted. I turned and ran toward the front door. My fingers slid over the cold, rusty doorknob. The door wouldn't open. It was as if an invisible force held it in place. I pulled with all my strength, cold sweat running down my face. The radio emitted a deafening hiss, and then the voice came back, louder and clearer than ever. "He won't let anyone out." A deadly chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, my eyes widening at what I saw. The shadow was approaching the center of the room. It was a humanoid figure, but without any defined features. Its body seemed to be made of black smoke and burning oil, its contours moving as if it were alive. Two glowing eyes, red as glowing coals, fixed me. The figure let out a deep breath, which sounded like a distant growl. The entire room seemed to close in around me, the walls leaning toward me. "Please, run!" The voice on the radio pleaded, now weak and distorted. With a cry of despair, I gave the door a violent kick. It burst open and I ran outside, the cold desert air burning my lungs. Behind me, the house seemed to expel a wave of darkness, as if the night itself were being vomited out through the door. I ran toward the truck, my boots slipping in the sand. I jumped into the cab and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I stepped on the gas and the truck surged forward, throwing sand and rocks behind it. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house moving away. The shadow stood in the doorway, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. The figure didn't move. It just watched as I fled. The truck's radio was still on, static hissing softly. Suddenly, the voice came back, barely a whisper now. "Thank you." The static faded, replaced by silence. My mind was racing. What had happened? Who was that voice? What was that shadow? I had no answers, but one thing was certain. I would never go back to that place again. After a few miles, I stopped the truck on the side of the road to catch my breath. The desert was calm again, as if nothing had happened. I looked at the radio. The frequency was 66.6 FM. I frowned. There was no such frequency. I turned off the radio and looked at the horizon. The road stretched out in front of me, inviting and empty. I took a deep breath and put the truck in drive. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something that didn't belong in this world. And then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled again. The same voice whispered, this time more distant, "He's still coming." The frequency on the display flashed, 66.6 FM. I knew that this road would never be the same again.